Our first presenter this morning is Dr. Bruce Grayson. Dr. Bruce Grayson, this is his first visit to India, and for the past 3 decades, his research has focused on near-death experiences. His work has resulted in more than 80 presentations and 100 publications in academic and medical journals. He is the Chester Carlson Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Studies and the Director of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. And he's also a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. So please, everybody, welcome Dr. Bruce Grayson.
Yesterday morning, His Holiness joked that his brain was too cold to try to speak in English. I feel the same way today. Yes. I want to start by thanking Geshe Lakhdar and Bryce Johnson for organizing this conference and keeping everything running so smoothly. I also want to thank Karma and Palden and all the many other people who have been working behind the scenes to take care of us, providing us with everything from excellent translations to warm tea. Yesterday, we focused on some very, very big questions. Is there consciousness in other galaxies? What was the origin of consciousness? What is it like to be a bat or an octopus or a tree? This morning, I want to shift the focus to an easier question. What is it like to be a human being? Most Western scientists assume that consciousness is produced in some way by the brain. There is, of course, a lot of evidence for that position. There is common sense evidence from our everyday lives. When you drink too much alcohol, or when you get knocked hard on your head, you don't think very clearly. We also have more sophisticated evidence from science of the link between the brain and consciousness. We can measure electrical activity in the brain during certain kinds of mental tasks and identify correlations between different areas of the brain and different activities. We can stimulate parts of the brain and record what experiences result. And we can remove parts of the brain and observe the effects on behavior. All of this evidence suggests that the brain is indeed involved in thinking, perception, and memory. But it does not necessarily suggest that the brain causes those thoughts, perceptions, and memories. As you are listening to me speak, there is electrical activity in the temporal lobe of your brain in an area called Brodmann's area. But does that electrical activity in your brain suggest that your temporal lobe is producing the sound of my voice? Not at all. All of the studies showing brain areas associated with different mental functions show only correlations, not causation. They are entirely consistent with the idea that thoughts, perceptions, and memories could take place in a consciousness somewhere separate from the brain, but are then received and processed by specific areas in the brain. It's much like a telephone or a radio or a television. The signal, the message, is created somewhere else, but your cell phone is necessary to receive and process the message. If we were to measure the electrical activity inside your cell phone, or electrically excite certain parts of it, or remove certain vital parts of your cell phone, we could show that certain parts of the phone were involved in your hearing the phone message. But we would not be proving that the message originated within your cell phone, any more than we can prove that our thoughts originate within our brains. Western science is largely reductionistic. That is, it breaks everything down to its component parts, which are much easier to study than the whole. But as Chris Impey said yesterday, the component parts sometimes do not act like the whole. The brain is composed of millions of nerve cells or neurons. But a single neuron, as Chris told us, cannot formulate a thought. A single neuron cannot feel angry or cold. It seems that brains, we think, can think and feel, but brain cells can't. We don't know how many neurons you need in order for them to collectively formulate a thought. And we don't know how that collection of neurons can think when a single neuron can't. As Chris said yesterday, scientists get around this problem by saying that consciousness is an emergent property of brains, a property that emerges when a large enough mass of brain cells get together. What does that mean? We have no idea what that means. Saying that something is an emergent property is a way of saying that it is a mystery that we can't explain. There is, in fact, no known mechanism by which physical processes in the brain or anywhere else can produce non-physical things like thoughts, perceptions, and memories. The materialistic understanding of the world fails to deal with just how an electrical impulse or a chemical trigger in the brain can produce a thought or a feeling, or indeed anything that the mind does. And yet, despite having no idea how it could work, most neuroscientists continue to maintain this 19th century materialistic view that the brain, in some miraculous way we don't understand, produces consciousness. And they discount or ignore the evidence that consciousness, in extreme circumstances, can function very well without a brain. Now, this idea that the mind and the brain are separate things was what most people in the world believed until a couple of hundred years ago. But in the 19th century, at least in the West, beginning with the Darwinians and the physiological psychologists, we started exploring the notion that the physical brain might be the source of all our thoughts and emotions, indeed of all of consciousness. For the past century, psychologists have been moving toward the hardcore materialism that characterized 19th century physics, a physics based on classical Newtonian mechanics. They've been attempting to show that consciousness is nothing more than the working of the physical brain. This materialistic psychology was succinctly captured by the American psychologist John Watson, who wrote, quote, "Psychology, as we view it, is a purely objective, experimental branch of science that needs consciousness as little as do the sciences of chemistry and physics." It is ironic that while Watson was linking psychology to classical Newtonian physics, physicists, faced with overwhelming experimental evidence, were already moving away from that materialistic view of the universe to a quantum physics that could not be formulated without reference to consciousness playing an independent role in the universe. As Harold Morowitz, a molecular biophysicist at Yale University, wrote, quote, "It is as if the two disciplines, psychology and physics, were on fast-moving trains going in opposite directions and not noticing what is happening across the tracks." Just as the materialistic idea that the brain produces the mind is a reasonably good model for our everyday lives, so too classical Newtonian physics was a reasonably good model for everyday objects moving at everyday speeds. It was only when physicists started investigating extraordinary circumstances about 100 years ago involving objects approaching the speed of light or the behavior of microscopic wave particles that we saw the limitations of the classical Newtonian model and the need for new paradigms. The result was the development of quantum physics, which explained the world in ways that classical Newtonian physics could not. But the price physicists paid in developing quantum physics was to acknowledge consciousness as a fundamental aspect of existence, independent of matter. So too with the question of the mind-brain relationship. It is only when we look at extraordinary circumstances of mental function, such as what happens when we approach death, that we see the limitations of the materialistic model of mind-brain identity and the need for a different paradigm. Geshe Choden said yesterday that, according to Buddhist teaching, consciousness can sustain itself without a brain, or indeed without any other physical form. 19th century reductionistic science viewed consciousness as an emergent property that evolved with complex brains. But just as quantum physics now views consciousness as an irreducible component in the universe, so too scientific research in the past century has explored human experiences that suggest consciousness can function without a brain. The evidence that I'm going to discuss this morning is derived entirely from scientific research, but I do not want to give you the impression that this evidence is widely accepted by Western scientists. In fact, most Western scientists are completely unaware that this evidence even exists. What then are these data that challenge the materialistic conception that consciousness is produced entirely by the brain? This is the University of Virginia, where I work. For the past half century, the University of Virginia has had a research division dedicated solely to the scientific investigation of these human experiences that challenge the materialistic philosophy that brain and mind are the same, and suggest instead that the mainstream ideas about the relationship between matter and consciousness are incomplete. In the mid-1960s, Chester Carlson, a wealthy American inventor who invented the first photocopy machine, which he called the Xerox machine, started giving away his fortune. He told his wife that his one remaining ambition in life was to die a poor man. His wife introduced him to Buddhism, and he went on to fund several Buddhist centers in New York, including the Rochester Zen Center, led by Philip Kapleau, and the Dai Bosatsu Zendo Kangoji Zen Monastery, led by Edo Tai Shimano. For his good works, Chester Carlson was given the Dharma name Daitokoen Zenshin Carlson Koji. But Carlson was also a scientist, trained as a physicist, and he wanted to support a bridge between Buddhism and Western science. He had heard about very young children in India who appeared to remember their past lives, and he searched for a Western neuroscientist who was interested in investigating these children. He found an eager disciple in Ian Stevenson, the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. Carlson donated to the university the funds to establish our research division. And with Carlson's financial and moral support, Professor Stevenson resigned as chairman of the department to devote himself full-time to the scientific study of these children who seemed to recall past lives and to other human experiences that suggest that consciousness may at times function without the use of a physical brain. As it happened, shortly thereafter, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, began periodic visits to the University of Virginia to visit Jeffrey Hopkins, a professor of Tibetan Buddhist studies, who served as His Holiness's chief translator in English until 1989. In this photo, you can see Professor Hopkins, Professor Stevenson, and His Holiness at the University of Virginia in 1979. I had worked with Professor Stevenson since the early 1970s, when I was training to be a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. Under his mentorship, I studied a variety of human experiences that suggested consciousness functioning separate from the brain. But I focused primarily on near-death experiences, the complex experiences that some people have on the threshold of death, when the brain is shutting down. 10 years ago, Professor Stevenson retired, and I succeeded him as director of our research division. So what are these experiences that challenge the prevailing materialistic paradigm that consciousness cannot exist without a functioning brain? There are 4 lines of evidence that I wish to discuss with you this morning. These are, first, the unexplained recovery of consciousness among people who have been unconscious for prolonged periods of time in the moments or days before their death. Second, the complex consciousness among people who have minimal brain tissue. Third, surprisingly complex consciousness in near-death experiences when the brain is not functioning or functioning at a greatly diminished level. And finally, young children who recall accurate details of a past life. The first challenging phenomenon I want to discuss is the surprising recovery on the deathbed of mental functions that had long been lost. This unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death in patients suffering from severe neurologic or psychiatric disorders has been reported in the Western medical literature over the past 250 years, but has received little attention. There are cases published in the medical literature of patients suffering from brain abscesses, tumors, strokes, meningitis, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, schizophrenia, and mood disorders, all of whom had long ago lost the ability to think or communicate. In many of these patients, there was evidence from brain scans or from autopsies that their brains had deteriorated to an irreversible degree. And yet, in all of these cases, mental clarity returned in the last minutes, hours, or sometimes days before the patient's death. We have identified 83 cases mentioned in the Western medical literature and have collected additional unpublished contemporary accounts. Complete recovery of consciousness just before death is not a common experience. In 1844, a German psychiatrist named Julius estimated that it occurred in 13% of patients who had died in his institution. However, in a recent investigation of end-of-life experiences in the United Kingdom, 70% of caregivers in nursing homes reported that they had observed patients with dementia and confusion becoming completely lucid in their last hours before death. In a case that we recently investigated, a 42-year-old man developed a malignant brain tumor that rapidly grew in size. He quickly became bedridden, blind in one eye, and unable to communicate, became completely incoherent and bizarre in his behavior. He appeared to be unable to make any sense of his surroundings, and when his family touched him, he would slap as if he were slapping at an insect. He eventually stopped sleeping and would talk deliriously throughout the night, making no sense. After several weeks of that, he suddenly, one night, appeared calm and started speaking coherently, and then slept peacefully. The following morning, he remained completely clear and talked with his wife, discussing his imminent death for the first time. However, he stopped speaking in a few minutes and died soon thereafter. A second case involving Alzheimer's disease was reported by Erlander Haraldsson, a psychologist in Iceland. An 81-year-old woman had been demented for a long time and was living in a nursing home. Her family took turns visiting her, even though she didn't recognize them and hadn't spoken to them for a year. On one occasion, her son Leiter was sitting at her bedside, working on a crossword puzzle. Suddenly, she looked up at him. She looked him directly in the face and said, "My son Leiter, I'm going to recite a verse for you." She then recited a poem clearly and loudly. She then lay back on her pillow and remained quiet until she died. There is no known physiological mechanism for this phenomenon. It is indeed rare, but the fact that it happens at all has no explanation in terms of how the brain functions. It suggests that the link between consciousness and the brain is more complex than we usually think. It is as if the damaged brain prevents the person from thinking or communicating. But then, as the brain finally begins to die, consciousness is released from the grasp of the degenerating brain. Another challenging phenomenon is the presence of normal or even high intelligence in people who have very little brain tissue. There are, again, rare but surprising cases of people who seem to function normally in life, with normal intelligence and normal social function, despite having virtually no brain at all. In one case, published in 2007, a high school honor student who had been accepted into Smith College underwent surgery after she was injured and knocked unconscious in an automobile accident. An X-ray of her head just before surgery revealed that she had no cerebral cortex at all. She had just a brainstem inside her skull. And when the surgeon opened up her skull to operate, that is exactly what he found, just a brainstem with no cerebral cortex. Now, our best understanding of the normal brain is that the brainstem relays motor and sensory signals to the cerebellum and the spinal cord and integrates heart function, breathing, level of wakefulness, and other animal functions. But the brainstem does not have the connections to perform higher cognitive functions like thinking, perceiving, making decisions, and so on. That can only happen in the cerebral cortex, which this young girl did not have. So this young college-bound honor student, according to our best understanding of the brain, should have been completely unable to formulate any thought of any kind, let alone function at a high intellectual level. John Lorber, a British neurologist, specialized in children who have hydrocephalus, or water on the brain. Children with this condition have an abnormal amount of cerebrospinal fluid build up in the cavities inside their brain, compressing the brain tissue and usually leading to blindness, seizures, mental retardation, paralysis, and if it's not treated, to death. However, Lorber described dozens of children and eventually some adults who had severe hydrocephalus but seemed to lead normal lives. In fact, in a sample of children in whom the cerebrospinal fluid filled up 95% of their skull, leaving virtually no space for any brain tissue, half of them had IQs greater than 100. 30 years ago, Lorber published an article in the prestigious journal Science entitled, "Is Your Brain Really Necessary?" The brain scan on the left of this slide is a normal brain. The gray area is the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that thinks. And the black area in the very center is the cerebrospinal fluid in the central cavity. On the right is the brain of an adult with very severe hydrocephalus. The vast majority of his head is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, with only a very thin ridge of brain tissue pressed against the skull. Hardly enough to allow this person to live, let alone function normally, according to modern medical neuroscience. However, this particular brain scan of the person with hydrocephalus was actually from a graduate student in mathematics at Cambridge University with an IQ of 126. Some of the best evidence of consciousness functioning independently of the brain comes from near-death experiences. Profound experiences that some people report when they have been on the threshold of death. Of course, there was a Tibetan tradition of people called dalogs who have returned from death to describe what they've experienced. Their experiences are in some ways similar to the near-death experiences that I am talking about. But the typical dalogs leave their body for many days rather than just a few minutes, and their experiences usually include extensive travel to a realm beyond death. The near-death experiences that I am talking about are very brief accounts of people who have been clinically dead, but are then resuscitated or revived spontaneously after a brief interval with memories of what they experienced during that period. They typically report exceptional mental clarity, vivid sensory imagery, a clear memory of the experience, and an experience that is more real than their everyday life. All of this occurring under conditions of drastically altered brain function, under which the materialistic model would say that consciousness is impossible. These near-death experiences are reported by between 10 and 20% of people who are revived from clinical death. I have investigated almost 1,000 of these cases. The average age at the time of the near-death experience was 31 years, but there was a very wide range. One young girl reported an experience she had had when she was 8 months old and undergoing kidney surgery. The oldest near-death experiencer I have studied was 81 at the time of his heart attack. About 1/3 of these near-death experiences occurred during surgical operations, 1/4 during serious illness, and 1/4 happened during life-threatening accidents. The common features of near-death experiences can be categorized as changes in thinking, changes in emotional state, paranormal features, and otherworldly features. Changes in thinking during the near-death experience include a sense of time being altered. Often people report that time stopped or ceased to exist during the experience. It also includes a sense of revelation or sudden understanding, in which everything in the universe suddenly becomes crystal clear. There is a sense of the person's thoughts going much faster than usual and being much clearer than usual. And finally, there was a life review or panoramic memory in which the person's entire life seems to flash before them. Typical emotions reported during the near-death experience include an overwhelming sense of peace and well-being, a sense of cosmic unity or being one with everything, a feeling of complete joy, and a sense of being loved unconditionally. The paranormal features often reported in near-death experiences include a sense of leaving the physical body, sometimes called an out-of-body experience. An experience of the person's physical senses, such as vision and hearing, becoming more vivid than ever before. Sometimes people report seeing colors and hearing sounds that do not exist in this life. And a sense of extrasensory perception, knowing things beyond the range of the physical senses, such as things that are happening at a remote location. And finally, visions of the future. Finally, many people report that in their near-death experiences, they entered some other unearthly world or realm of existence. Many report that they came to a border they could not cross, or a point of no return, that if they had crossed, they would not be allowed to return to life. Many report encountering some kind of mystical or divine being. And some report seeing deceased spirits, often loved ones who had died previously, who seemed to be welcoming them into another realm, or in some cases sending them back to life. One of the things about near-death experiences that interests me most as a psychiatrist is the profound after effects. People reliably report a consistent pattern of changes in attitudes, beliefs, and values that do not seem to fade over time. Near-death experiencers report overwhelmingly that they are more spiritual after the experience, that they have more compassion for others and a greater desire to help others. a greater appreciation for life, and a stronger sense of meaning or purpose in life. An overwhelming majority of near-death experiences report that they have a stronger belief that we survive death of the body. And just as many report that they have no longer any fear of death. About half report that they have completely lost interest in material possessions, and many report that they no longer have any interest in personal prestige or in status or in competition. Now, some of you may be thinking that these people are now following the Buddha. They show more compassion, they tend to try to help others, they're less attached to material possessions and status. But as His Holiness pointed out yesterday, these values are not uniquely Buddhist. These are universal values. Almost all spiritual traditions teach compassion and the transience of worldly rewards. Near-death experiencers are not simply becoming more Buddhist, they are becoming more spiritual. I want to highlight three particular features of near-death experiences that particularly suggest that consciousness is not produced by the brain. These three features of near-death experiences are, first, clear thinking, perception, and memory while the brain is incapacitated. Second, accurate perceptions from a visual perspective outside the physical body. And third, encounters with deceased persons who convey accurate information that no one else could have known, including, in some cases, encounters with deceased persons who were not known at the time to have died, or were not known by the experiencer at all. Perhaps the most important of these features, simply because it is the most common, is the first. Among several hundred near-death experiencers that I have studied, 47% report that their thinking during the experience is clearer than it is in their normal waking state. In addition, 38% report their thinking is faster than usual. 29% describe their thinking as more logical than usual. And 17% say they have more control over their thoughts than they usually do. Furthermore, an analysis of their medical records shows that mental functioning is significantly better in those people who come closest to death. Moreover, many experiencers report that during their near-death experience they had a panoramic life review, not just single brief images that can be evoked by electrical stimulation of the brain, but elaborate events, sometimes from the entirety of that person's life. Let me give you an example of clear thinking during a near-death experience. A 25-year-old nurse had become deeply depressed and decided to end his life by taking a suicidal overdose. He took some medication from the hospital where he worked. After taking the overdose, he lay down on his bed expecting to die. Instead, he became quite ill, with nausea and painful stomach cramps. He then decided to telephone for help, so he got up out of his bed and tried to walk to the telephone. However, by now he was quite sedated and confused from the overdose, and he had great difficulty standing and walking. In addition, he was having hallucinations of many small people in his apartment who were stopping him from getting to the telephone. In that confused state, he suddenly felt himself leave his physical body, and he found himself standing 10 feet behind his body and above it. From that new visual perspective, he watched his body sway unsteadily, and he could see his body looking around in confusion at the imaginary people. He remembered having seen the hallucinations when he was in his body, and he could see his body still appearing confused. But he himself, from that position 10 feet behind the body, was thinking very clearly and could not see the hallucinated little people. So his center of consciousness had left his body and was thinking very clearly, while his brain was still hallucinating and confused. Another important feature that challenges the materialistic model of consciousness and the brain is being out of the body and accurately perceiving things that one could not see normally. Among several hundred near-death experiences I have studied, 48% report out-of-body experiences. In 1982, the American cardiologist Michael Sabom published a study in which he asked near-death experiencers who had reported leaving their bodies during cardiopulmonary resuscitation to describe in detail what they had seen. He also asked a matched group of seasoned cardiac patients to imagine watching their resuscitations and to try to describe it from a third-person perspective. 80% of the matched group who did not have near-death experiences made major errors in their descriptions. None of the near-death experiencers made any errors, and 19% of them described specific idiosyncratic and unexpected events that happened during their resuscitation. A few years ago, the Welsh intensive care nurse Penny Sartori published a 5-year study in which she replicated these same findings. She found that all the near-death experiencers who claimed to have left their bodies described accurate resuscitation scenarios, whereas all of the cardiac arrest survivors who did not have near-death experiencers gave incorrect descriptions of the equipment and the procedures. The American psychologist Kenneth Ring reported a study of 31 blind near-death experiencers, many of them blind from birth, who were able to describe the scene around them while they were out of their bodies, in some cases even including accurate descriptions of the colors of some objects. In a recent review of 93 published reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body experiences during the near-death experience, the American psychologist Jan Holden found that 92% were completely accurate, 6% contained some minor error, and only 1% was wrong. Even in cases in which the out-of-body perceptions were reported to an independent witness before they were verified, the numbers were greater than 90% accurate. If you asked all of us what we saw here yesterday, I don't think we could be more than 90% accurate. Let me give you an example of an accurate out-of-body perception. A 56-year-old van driver had an acute heart arrhythmia due to blockage of his coronary artery, and he underwent emergency coronary bypass operation. During the procedure, while he was fully anesthetized, he left his body and was able to look down and see his body on the operating table. To his surprise, he also saw the surgeon standing by the operating table, appearing to flap his wings as if he were trying to fly. That's not something that you would have expected a surgeon to be doing. The day after the operation, he asked the surgeon why he had been flapping his arms during the procedure. The surgeon seemed very embarrassed, and he angrily asked the patient who had told him about that. The patient responded that no one had told him, that he had seen it himself from above during the operation. When he eventually got over his embarrassment, the surgeon explained that he was watching his assistants perform the operation and that he was supervising them. In order to ensure that his hands, which were in sterilized gloves, did not touch anything that was contaminated, he put them somewhere he knew they wouldn't touch anything, flat against his chest. And he instructed his assistants in the operation by motioning with his elbows of where to cut, looking like he was trying to fly. Finally, among several hundred near-death experiences I have studied, 42% reported meeting recognizable deceased acquaintances in their near-death experiences. These encounters were more likely to be reported the closer the person has come to death. In 33% of these cases, the person was not someone that the experiencer wanted to see or expected to see, but was instead someone else, someone they didn't necessarily want to see. That would be surprising if these visions were hallucinations that were caused by someone's expectations and wishful thinking. Most impressively, some of these deceased persons seen during the near-death experience were people who were not known to be dead at the time. Let me give you an example. An American pediatrician, Dr. K.M. Dale, treated a 9-year-old boy with meningitis who hovered near death for 36 hours before his fever finally broke. During those 36 hours, he was surrounded by his anxious parents who never left his hospital bed during that vigil. When his fever finally broke, as soon as he opened his eyes, the boy described having gone to heaven where he saw several of his deceased relatives. And then he added that he had also seen his sister Teresa, who told him that he had to go back to his body. Now the boy's father got very upset when he heard this, because his daughter was at college 1,500 kilometers away in another state and was perfectly healthy. But the boy insisted that Teresa had sent him back and told him that she had to stay there. His father then left the hospital, promising his wife that he would call their daughter as soon as he got home. But when he tried to telephone Teresa, he learned that the college officials had been trying unsuccessfully all night to reach the family to tell them the tragic news that Teresa had in fact been killed around midnight in an automobile accident. Even more impressively, sometimes the deceased person seen in the near-death experience was someone the experiencer had not known even existed. The Swiss-American physician Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published the account of a girl who had a near-death experience during heart surgery and later said she had met her brother, although as far as she knew she never had a brother. Her father, moved by this vivid account, acknowledged that her parents had, in fact, had a son who had died before she had been born, and they never mentioned him to her. Now, of course, if consciousness is produced by the brain, then when the brain dies, consciousness ends. It cannot continue into another incarnation. So if some of us do remember our past lives, then those memories cannot reside solely in the brain. The final phenomenon I want to discuss with you are these cases that my mentor Ian Stevenson investigated of very young children who claim to remember their past lives. The majority of these children live in societies that have some cultural belief in rebirth, and a great many of those live here in India. To study these children, Stevenson traveled many times to remote villages throughout India to interview these children and their families. Our group at the University of Virginia has studied more than 2,400 cases of these very young children who spontaneously start talking about their past life. About half of these children live in Asia, most of them in India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. They usually begin speaking about these past life memories between the ages of 2 and 5 years. And in most cases, those memories tend to fade between the ages of 6 and 9 years. The child gives enough detailed information that we can identify the past life in 60% of these cases. The average age of death in the past life is 33 years, but that varies from country to country. In places like the United States and Europe, where there is less violence in the culture and healthcare is more available, the age tends to be higher. In 60% of cases, the past life remembered ended violently, either in a tragic accident or by intentional wounding. The average time that passes between the death in the past life and the birth in the present life is 12 years. But that too varies in keeping with cultural beliefs. For example, among the Druze in Lebanon, the children tend to be born immediately upon the death of the past life, which is in keeping with their cultural belief. As you might expect, these cases are not easy to investigate. This is a picture of Ian Stevenson interviewing a young girl and her parents in an Indian village with an interpreter sitting next to him. These children often live in remote villages that are hard to reach, and they often require Western researchers to interview the children through a translator. There are several features of these cases that challenge the assumption that all our thoughts and memories are produced by the brain. First, these children often have detailed and specific memories that correspond to the life of someone who had lived and died in a distant location, of whom they could have had no knowledge by normal means. They will mention the names and occupations of relatives and friends from the past life, and often the specific details of how that past life ended. In many cases, we can take the child to the remote village where he or she claimed to have lived previously, and the child is able to identify people and places he had never seen before in this life. Second, these children sometimes exhibit unusual personality traits, likes and dislikes, that are incompatible with their present lives. For example, some of these children recall a past life of the opposite gender, and they want to dress and play like someone of the opposite gender. A child born to a Hindu family may recall a past life as a Muslim, and he will reject the food his mother cooks because it was not prepared in the Muslim manner. Several young Burmese children claim to remember lives as Japanese pilots who were shot down over Burma in World War II. They rejected the spicy Burmese food and requested Japanese cuisine such as raw fish. And they rejected the traditional Burmese clothes and wanted pants like the Japanese wore. Many children who recall past lives have fears that they relate to their past lives. For example, a child who recalls having been drowned in a well may have an unusual fear of water. Finally, third, some of these children exhibit unusual skills that they have not been taught, and indeed that no one in their village knows. For example, a child may be able to play a musical instrument without being taught, or may have skills related to their occupation in the past life. We have studied children in Sri Lanka, in villages where only the Tamil language is spoken, and yet the child can converse in Sinhalese. Finally, some of these children have very unusual and unexplained birthmarks or birth defects that they attribute to their death in a past life. These birthmarks and birth defects that are said to correspond to the death wounds in the past life occur in about 1/3 of the children we have investigated. Sometimes the birthmarks fade as the child grows up, but in other cases they do not. And of course, birth defects persist throughout the life of the child. In 18% of these cases, we can confirm through medical records or autopsy reports that the death wounds from the past life do indeed correspond to the birthmarks or birth defects in the present child. Let me give you a few short examples of these unusual birth defects. These are the hands of Mien Thein, a Burmese girl born in 1956. She remembered the life of a man who was riding home on his bicycle when he was stopped by a gang who had been hired to kill him. They made him get down on his knees and prepare to cut his head off with a sword. At the last moment of his life, as he was on his knees facing the swordsman, he suddenly raised his hands to plead for mercy, or maybe to protect his face from the sword. And the fingertips on both his hands were cut off by the sword. As a child, this girl, Mien Thein, insisted on wearing boys' clothes and referred to her actions with masculine verb forms. These are the hands of Lek Pal, an Indian boy born in Uttar Pradesh. He remembered the life of another boy named Hukum Singh, who lived in a distant village, who, when he was only 3 years old, got his right hand caught in an automatic fodder chopping machine, and he lost fingers of just that one hand. When Lek Pal was eventually taken to the village where Hukum Singh had lived in the past life, he identified the correct location where the accident had taken place, and he also correctly identified the man who was operating the fodder chopper machine when the 3-year-old Hukum Singh had caught his fingers in. This is the back head of a little girl named Jacinta Agbo, born in Nigeria. She was born with this unexplained 3-centimeter wide birthmark that goes completely around her head. There is no physiological mechanism that can explain a birthmark of this type. She remembered the life of a man who had been hit on the head with a club during a quarrel 10 years before she was born. And the man had surgery to drain the blood from his head and reconstruct the broken skull bones. This photo was taken when she was 2 years old. When we interviewed her several years later, she showed definite masculine traits and habits. Although many of the strongest cases of children who remember past lives come from cultures where there is a belief in rebirth, we also have some very impressive cases from Christian families in the United States in which there is no prior knowledge of rebirth and certainly no interest or belief in it. This is a 2-year-old boy named James Leininger, who was born in Louisiana, who seemed to remember being shot down over the Pacific Ocean in World War II nearly 60 years earlier. The boy would often play with airplanes and wake up screaming from nightmares about being trapped in an airplane that was on fire. When he was 3 years old, his mother bought him a toy airplane and pointed out what she thought were bombs under the wings. But little James corrected her, saying that those weren't bombs, they were drop tanks, something she had never heard of. He eventually gave many more details of his past life, saying that he flew an airplane called a Corsair that used to get flat tires frequently, something that military historians confirm is often true of Corsairs. He also gave the name of the aircraft carrier he flew from as the Natoma, and he said that he was killed flying over Iwo Jima, and that his best friend was another pilot named Jack Larson. Now, little James's father was a policeman and a devout Christian, a Baptist, who was quite opposed to the idea of rebirth. He researched this story, trying to discredit it. Instead, he found that there was an aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay at the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945, and that only one American pilot was shot down in that battle, a man named James Houston, when his Corsair airplane was shot down and caught on fire. This is the 21-year-old James Houston in his Corsair airplane shortly before the Battle of Iwo Jima. Little boy James Leininger's parents tried to find this pilot's family. They eventually found his sister, who lived in California nearly 3,000 miles away. And here's a little boy with the person he claimed to be his sister in the past life. She confirmed that her dead brother, James Houston, did have a friend named Jack Larson. And the little boy spontaneously identified several objects in her home that had belonged to her dead brother. She is convinced that this little boy is indeed the rebirth of her brother. So in summary, there is abundant evidence from life and from scientific research that the brain, under extraordinary circumstances, seems to come unlinked from consciousness. And consciousness can, in fact, function better without the mediation of the physical brain. Again, I want to say that this evidence is not accepted by most American scientists. In fact, is not known by most American scientists. Nevertheless, it is there, and it is reliable and reproducible evidence. We have cases of people whose brain have been deteriorating for years who suddenly think clearly on their deathbeds. We have people who function normally, sometimes with high intelligence, who have virtually no brain tissue. We have people who during near-death experiences, think more clearly than ever when their brains are not functioning. And we have very young children who can barely speak, who talk about their past lives with accurate details. These phenomena, all well investigated by modern scientific methodologies and building upon decades or centuries of prior research, strongly suggest that under extraordinary circumstances, consciousness can be produced and can function without the intercession of a physical brain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. That was an extremely fascinating, provocative talk. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. And so I encourage the audience to start to formulate questions, and we'll gather them and fold them into the discussion. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask a first question. So to me, as a scientist, this is a sociological question. If you have a field where all you have is a correlation rather than a causative, testable physical theory for why mind and brain should be linked, and you have data that you need to explain, what is the reason why, in the field of gravity, the advancing perihelion of Mercury, a small effect, perhaps a fly in the ointment, but a persistent data that had to be explained led to the downfall of Newtonian gravity and the rise of general relativity, a completely new paradigm. Why, in your view, has no analogous progress been made?
It's an excellent question. Is this on?
Yeah.
That's an excellent question, Chris. Why has no new paradigm come up to explain these data? I think
associated with that, of course, why has the resistance been so relentless?
Right. There is tremendous resistance among Western scientists to the idea that consciousness and brain are separate, because most of Western science is built on this materialistic model. The materialistic way of looking at things has produced many good things in our society. The problem is that many scientists confuse the materialistic philosophy with the scientific method. And all these great things that we enjoy, the modern technology we enjoy, is a result of the scientific method, not necessarily of the materialistic philosophy. But they've been linked so tightly together for the past several hundred years that it's hard for scientists to think of a science without materialism. Now that has changed in the last century among theoretical physicists. They study things that can't be seen or felt or measured directly. Particles that are so small and last such a short period of time they cannot be seen, they cannot be measured. So what they do is they shoot these particles through what's called a bubble chamber, a box full of liquid, and as the particle goes through the liquid, it leaves a trail of bubbles. So you measure the effects of the particle, but you can't measure the particle. You assume that there was a particle there to produce the bubbles. And from the trail of bubbles, you can learn a lot about these particles that can't be seen. In the same way, the things that we're talking about, consciousness, cannot be seen, but it does leave effects. Consciousness leaves a trail of bubbles that we can follow. And through the effects, we can make inferences about consciousness. The reason we don't have a good model to rival materialism is that I think the question is too complicated. We'll get there eventually, but I think, as His Holiness said yesterday, Western science is geared towards studying physical phenomena. It has not even thought about how to approach mental phenomena. And maybe when we combine the 2,000-year-old tradition of meditation and introspection, we will find some way of merging science and consciousness research.
Thank you. I'd like to encourage the geshes if they have any questions at this point. Okay.
당고들 경험으로 테스트를 쉬어요. 아니 지다데 더 관수의 심주 쉬운당시로 베다게 오슈치. 되는 얘기는 티와 대직나 섬주도 쉬어질 티와도 가능시나. 단다 더 땡듀기 체리고 망치기 다데 다직 남시디 레베기 쯤바라 디젝틱 다지 망치 다가 경계요도 신하드네 그거 들어와. 안 된데는 가 섬었다 남시레디 다 레베기 쯤은 남시레디 표지 아니 두쟁이 떡이 다도 두개요도 치도 송랑도 그거 들어와. 된데는 안 수기 단 남시디라 베나 남시 레기 차다다 말레기 차베나 남 심시웨기리다 마시웨리 망보치로 두주 창마 아니 두쟁이 떡이 주어도 차고도 그래서 대산 주주도 망치다 된데는 아니 심시와니지 니 얘기 두제디니 따직 뉴스니 디 두제디 따직 먼저 도와미 탐지라 두스다 주얘기 탑시도 두스다 딩딩이 차리본 남이 두스 뚝뚝이 요담는 게 두스다 두스티와 쉐인스.
It seems that most of the modern neuroscientists, they believe that consciousness is something that is produced by the brain or the function of the brain. And since we have different layers of consciousness or different types of consciousness, like at the happy state or the sad state, so there are different states. And can we recognize a different physical entity or a physical particle that is responsible for different mental states? And if that is the case, then is there any way that we can produce these respective physical entities which is responsible for different mental states like happiness.
I think the problem comes in saying that these physical entities are responsible for the states or are causing the states. We can find some physical phenomena that are associated with those states, but they are not necessarily causing them. For example, when people are severely depressed, there are changes in the neurochemicals in the brain, but it's not clear whether those changes in the neurotransmitters are causing the depression or are the result of depression. They're what we call biological markers, so we can associate the mental state with the biological changes, but we can't say which one is cause and which one is effect.
I'd like to go to some very good questions from the audience. Let me pick one here. There seems to be some significant parallelism between the research you've done and the phenomena you describe and things that seem to happen in dreams. Enhanced mental function, paranormal phenomena, hyper-realization of senses. Is there any deliberate attempt to make connections there or to use the dream research in a way that illuminates what you're talking about?
We have not done that, but some people have tried to do that. They have tried to associate the phenomena in near-death experiences with the phenomena in a variety of states, not only dreams, but drug-induced states, meditative states. And there are certainly some experiences that are common to all these altered states of consciousness. And there are some people who will argue that it doesn't matter how you get to that altered state, whether you do it through sleep, through lucid dreams, through drugs, through hypnosis, through electrical stimulation. Mm-hmm. But we do find that there are some differences. For example, almost everyone who has a near-death experience will be profoundly affected by that change, and they will be transformed in their attitudes, beliefs, and values. People who have the same type of unusual experience in a dream do not necessarily change their lives around. And in fact, if you ask them 10 years later, they may not remember the dream, but they will remember their near-death experience.
And a sort of connected question is, what is it about the quality of compression of a near-death experience? I mean, life itself is a near-death experience, but what is it about? I mean, and it sounds like what we really want is near-death in a pill. So we can just all take the pill and be more compassionate and have all these benefits of the near-death experience.
Well, that's the American attitude. We want it in a pill. But near-death experience, yes. I think anyone who comes close to death may be changed by that experience. Most people who almost die tend to value their life more highly. But there are many differences between just coming close to death and doing that and having a near-death experience. For example, if you just come close to death but do not have a near-death experience, you usually become more frightened of dying and you become much more cautious. If the doctor tells you to stop drinking, you will stop drinking. If you have a near-death experience, you are not afraid of dying anymore. And paradoxically, that makes you not afraid of living to the fullest. You take more risks. You become much more joyful in your life. That also makes you a lousy patient, because if the doctor tells you to stop drinking, you won't stop drinking because you're not afraid of dying.
Any questions from our guests there again, I'm sure.
경원전에 다들 지회 고관으로 도전하 쇼긴 당부디 배나 당연히 도버딘데 싶고서 당기 견라 고랑기 뭐 송나니 시디즘 벌이야 언제 배나 딱 견라 고랑기 다 망고질 제번랑 차샤 이네다 디나로네 당은저 세리보다 남버스 개워치 먹어지 지용기 돈이 배나다 언제 레버랑기 남시 좀 바켈레네다 말레네다 강다리네 배나 언제 남시 세드나 셈세디 모스 르불라 페뉴 딩기 어디 세브시라리스다 안수 다 겨왕아지 켈레메 계속 가면 뭐지 체 다가란 게 나로 근데 인디 좀발라 다 페나 뭐감 리베 아니 지 람루기 토네 사르도기 토네 페나 다 루심기 간요다 다지 남시다 셈리 되는 거 줄룰 다 니주 망보지다 데데베 간요 망보지 덴데 거리 딘데기 아니 간요세다 아니 지 디기 둔답다 딘데가 탑람도 카리오르베스 페나 수균기 나로리나 페나 루종세다 아니 지 곰투브다 딘데기 왕기 아니 강이 세답 딘데 망보 치고르스 다 딘데를 마덴바 아니 수균다 따투브다 딘데를 가야 마덴바 아니 지 ngokamri 랑기 토네 아니 지 루심기 간요세다 딘데가 티시로 딘 카리오르베스 디코르슈이 토체나
First of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation and also thank you for the for giving opportunity to ask this question. So it doesn't matter whether the consciousness is produced by the brain or consciousness is something else than the brain or the function of the brain. But what is obvious is that the mind or the consciousness can have effects on our body, and in contemplative traditions we have methods to deal with mind and brain problems and reduce using mind and for reducing physical discomforts. So other than contemplative traditions, from the scientific point of view or from scientific methods, what kind of scientific methods we should adopt to solve these mind-body problems or reduce physical discomforts?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I'm hoping that we'll get the answer in this conference. I think most Westerners are aware that there is a long tradition of consciousness research in Eastern cultures that they know nothing about. And they've been reluctant to learn more about it because they are so wedded to their way of thinking. And I understand that consciousness does have strong effects on the body and on health. The problem with getting Western medicine interested in that is there's no profit in consciousness. If you produce a pill or a procedure or a device to affect the body, you can make a lot of money in it. And you can make a lot of money doing research into it. But if you're talking about a contemplative discipline, you don't make much profit. So we are fighting an uphill battle with trying to get the attention of people who fund research to look into this question. But I think it is a place where Western medicine has to go, and that is increasingly becoming popular among the fringes of Western medicine. And I think it's only a matter of time before people see the power of some of the meditative techniques.
I'll do another question from the audience about, can you speculate maybe on why it is that the clarity and incidence of the rebirth experience plays out, particularly in the very early childhood stages, and then fades, or is there anything, if it's a universal, if it's a general phenomena, is there anything special about the instances that are found about those people?
That's a very good question. We don't really know why some people remember a past life at all, whereas most people do not. If you assume, as Buddhists do, that everybody is reborn, then obviously the normal procedure is to forget your past lives because most of us do not remember. So why do a few people remember? Is it something that has gone wrong that lets them remember? They don't seem to have any advantage. It does not seem to be that people who are particularly virtuous remember their past life. The few cases we have suggest that a strong attachment to the past life is one factor. For example, people who were killed prematurely or violently tend to remember their past lives. 70% of cases in some culture ended the past life in a violent manner. Also, some people who have some other strong attachment to the past life, for example, people who were monks in the past life and see themselves in a non-spiritual home, may remember the past life as a monk. The children tend to remember it at very early ages, age 2, 3, often when they're in some altered state, when they're sleepy, when they're being given a bath, when they're not engaged in normal activities. And then they will start to remember these things. And they come up sporadically, the memories come up sporadically during the day. As the child gets to be the age to go to school and gets more involved in this life, they tend to forget the past life. And by the time they are 6, 8, 9 years old, they tend to forget. Now, we have done some psychological testing with these children in Sri Lanka, in Lebanon, and in the United States. And if you test these children when they are 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they have higher IQs than their peers. They have much better verbal skills than their peers. You would think that would make them more successful in life, but it does not continue. If you test them again when they are teenagers, when they are forgotten, they are just like everybody else. They have lost that advantage. We don't know why they remember at all, and we don't know why they don't continue to remember. Now, there are some cases, very few cases, where we have identified the family the child claimed to have been in the past life, and the family has accepted the child and continued to see the child year after year. And in those cases, the memories may persist because of the continued contact with the past family. But those are unusual.
A postscript question on this from the panel is, what is your personal view on rebirth?
What is my personal view of rebirth? Many of the cases that we have are unexplainable in terms of Western medicine, but they're also unexplainable in the terms of the reincarnation hypothesis. Sometimes you will see two children who seem to remember the same past life. Sometimes you will see a child who remembers the past life of someone who died when the child was 6 months old. So the two lives overlapped. So it is not a clear model that we can follow. When I talk to near-death experiencers, they always say, when they start out explaining their experience, they say, first, words cannot explain my experience. I cannot describe it for you. And then I say, that's great, tell me all about it. So we force them to tell us what they experienced, and we know that they're not telling us what they experienced. They're putting it into words, things that don't fit into words. And I think the same is true of these rebirth memories. What actually happens is something that our brains cannot understand. So the models that we come up with do not really approach the reality. So if you ask me what I believe, I say that what happens after death is something that I can't possibly understand while I'm in this brain.
I'd like to thank Bruce and the panel to an extraordinary session, actually.
Thank you.